All right, we are back to the book of Ecclesiastes. We're going to be jumping into chapter 6. So if you want to find Ecclesiastes chapter 6, we will start there. We're going to actually go back and do a little bit of a review, though, because I want to remind you where we came from and where we are going. Solomon was the son of David, wisest man on the earth, builder of Solomon's temple, rich beyond measure, but empty. That's what this whole book is about. He's empty. He's looking at everything and all that he's accomplished, and it just isn't filling him the way that he thinks it should. This book is one of the more difficult books in all of Scripture, one which no one has ever completely mastered. Indeed, it has been so distorted by the miserable commentaries of many writers that it is almost a bigger job to purify and defend the author from the notions with which they have smuggled into him than it is to show his real meaning. There are two reasons why this book has been more obscure than others. In the first place, they did not see the purpose and aim of the author, which it is important to keep in mind and to follow in every kind of writing, and even more important here. The other reason was the ignorance of the Hebrew language and the special style of this author, which often diverges from the ordinary usage of the language and is very strange to our way of speaking. Now, the summary and aim of this book then is as follows. Solomon wants to put us at peace and to give us a quiet mind in the everyday affairs and business of this life, so that we live contentedly in the present without care and yearning about the future, and are, as Paul says, without care and anxiety. It is useless to plague oneself with anxiety about the future. By a sort of continuing induction from particulars, Solomon concludes that the efforts and endeavors of men are vain and useless, so that he draws a universal conclusion from particulars and shows that the efforts of all men are vain. What is being condemned in this book, therefore, is not the creatures, but the depraved affection and desire of us men. That was Martin Luther 500 years ago when somebody said, "Can you tell me what the book of Ecclesiastes is all about?" Now, a little bit from our last session, which took place quite a few months ago before we took a break for spiritual gifts. Verse 19 of chapter 5, God has also given riches and wealth to every man, and he has allowed him to enjoy them, take his reward, and rejoice in his labor. This is a gift of God. Now, St. Paul chimes in with, I rejoiced in the Lord greatly that once again you renewed your care for me. You were, in fact, concerned about me, but lacked the opportunity to show it. And so Paul says, here's the thing. He says, I want you to understand who you are, what you are. And he says, because God has given you this beautiful gift. And he says, you were willing to share with me, which was the purpose of the gift in the first place. I don't say this out of need, for I have learned to be content in whatever circumstances I am. I know both how to have a little and I know how to have a lot. In any and all circumstances, I have learned the secret of being content, whether well-fed or hungry, whether in abundance or need. And what Paul is saying very simply is, some days we eat well, some days we do not. And instead of complaining about either, or thinking either one of them is the way things should be, we need to find the middle ground. I'm able to do all things through him who strengthens me. Still, you did well by sharing with me in my hardship. Verse 20, for he does not often consider the days of his life because God keeps him occupied with the joy of his heart. Frederick Buechner says, this is where your deep gladness finds the world's deep hunger. Now, if you could do anything you wanted, what would it be? Why don't you just think about that for a second? No limits, okay? In other words, it's not about time, it's not about money, it's not about your physical capabilities. What is one thing that you would do if suddenly somebody came and said, I give you a blank slate. Whatever you want to do, I give you the ability to do it. See, if you could do anything you wanted, what would it be? And what would it have been when you were 10? What would it have been when you were 20? What would it have been when you were 30? What would it have been when you were 40? And I ask these questions because when you ask a 5 or a 6-year-old what they want to be when they grow up, they often say things like, I want to marry my mom. I want to be an astronaut, or I want to be a firefighter or a policeman, whatever it is, okay? What? Ballerina. These are the things, because it's imprinted. And if you ask a 5-year-old every day, they're liable to give you a different answer every day because they're highly influenced. When they get to be 10, peer pressure has started to kick in. By the time you're 20, you've graduated from high school, you may or may not be in college, your friends are starting to do things. When you're 40, you look at it and you say, okay, I'm roughly halfway through my life at this point. When you're 60, there's now more years behind you than there are in front of you, chances are. And this changes how we see our life, our purpose, and what we use our things for. The book of Ecclesiastes actually ends here. This is the theme that Solomon is trying to share. You, no matter who you are, have a life, and God wants you to enjoy it. But like most people, he decides he needs to go on for a couple of more chapters. So, moving on. Ecclesiastes 6, verse 1. Here is a tragedy I observed under the sun, and it weighs heavily on humanity. Now, this is interesting. I observed this, but I think it weighs heavily on all of humanity. So I got a question to ask. What anxieties or heavy things do you share with much or most of humanity? What requirements are there for humanity-level anxieties? See, the reason I ask this is because when you go to another country and you meet people, they do not share your language, your culture. They do not necessarily eat the same type of food you eat. They don't work the same kind of jobs that you work. But occasionally you discover that even though this person is very, very different from you in many ways, there are things that you share. What would those things be? What is it that Solomon could be looking out over, seeing all of this? What would be something that he would look out over and say, this is something that is humanity wide? Because this is what he's been driving at for the first 5 chapters. He says it's no good if what you are reading doesn't affect you. I've had people hand me books, say, Pastor, you're going to love this book. Sometimes I do. Sometimes I can't get past the 3rd page. I've had people say, you got to listen to this music, or you've got to watch this movie or this TV show. And sometimes I love it, and sometimes I'm like, I don't get it. So we're looking here, when we talk about Ecclesiastes, what is it that we're expected to find that almost everyone could say, yes, Solomon. So I always laugh because once in a while, after I preach a sermon, I'll have somebody come out and say, Pastor, that was the best sermon on, and then fill in the blank, tithing, giving, working my job, family forgiveness I've ever heard. And I go back and I read through my sermon. I can't find anything about those things in my sermon. In other words, either the Holy Spirit was listening to this person, or this person was sleeping and simply replaying last week's sermon. Okay? So they come in and they say, now, this is one of those moments that we have to understand that God put all of these books, 39 Old Testament, 27 New Testament, he put this all together so that all of us would find various things that make sense to us. That's why there's 4 Gospels. Mark is immediately Jesus did this, immediately did that. He skips the birth. He pretty much skips the resurrection. It's all about immediately Jesus did this and immediately. John, a little more poetic. Luke, because he's writing after the fact, it's much more of a chronological, and he interviewed people. Matthew, definitely for the Jews, starts off with the genealogy. In other words, everybody, no matter what kind of person we are, we can find one of these books, and this is what God's trying to do. But Solomon is trying to say this book should apply to just about everyone if they're honest with themselves. Verse 2. God gives a man riches, wealth, and honor so that he lacks nothing of all he desires for himself. But God does not allow him to enjoy them. Instead, a stranger will enjoy them. This is futile and a sickening tragedy. So again, some more questions for you. Do you have a will or a trust? And what is the purpose of your will or trust? If you sat down and made a will out, if you sat down and created a trust, what was the purpose of those things? Because you do that so that you can dictate, at least to a point, what everything that you are and everything that you have gathered, where it goes and to whom. When my parents were in their mid-80s, I came home one time. I was sitting in the living room. We'd been watching because, people in their 80s, my parents would watch Wheel of Fortune, American Pickers. They had, a few things. And all of a sudden, my mom, who never shut the TV off, she always needed background noise. She shut the TV off and she turned and she said, "Okay, Mitchie," she said, "here's some things we need you to know." Now, it was going to be 12 years again before my dad died, and it was going to be 7 years before my mom died. But they said, "These are things, we want you to have this. And we thought you wanted that. And your sister wants this. And so, if you want, you can take those things now." And I said, "No, I'll wait. It's kind of hard for me to take this stuff on the airplane." But all of a sudden, their reality was, we want to make sure. And they said, "Now, we've created a trust. Your sister is taking care of all of it, and she's got total control." And I said, "That's fine." But they sat down and they explained to me what they did and why they did it and the purpose behind it. When we start asking the purpose of our life, what is it that you think your life is about? What is it you think all your stuff, whether it's the cash in a bank, whether it's your car, your house, what is the purpose behind all those things? How much should you leave to your family? Warren Buffett said, "I want to give my children enough money for them to do anything, but not enough for them to do nothing." And if you look at that, what he's saying is, you know what? I'm not going to give them billions of dollars. And by the way, read about one of his sons, because one of his sons did an amazing thing. But it's one of those things that he said, "I'm going to give them enough to take care of themselves, but I don't want them just sitting around doing nothing." Bill Gates years ago had said, back when he was only worth like 1 or 2 billion, he was just going to give $5 million to his kids and just say, "That's enough for you." I don't know if that's changed or not. But the question is, what is the purpose and how much should you give to your family? What is the purpose of everything you earned, let alone everything you inherited or were given? If your parents died or grandparents or somebody who loved you and bequeathed to you something, and now this is yours, and you begin this gathering process, what do you do now? And what's the purpose of it? Do you just put it in the bank and leave it there? Do you wildly spend it? If you won the lottery today, let's just put it at $200 million. You get $100 million after taxes. What would you do with it? See, these are important questions because oftentimes we think that we know what we would do. But then we find ourselves taking that which we have and using it and saying, "Well, because I only have this, I'm going to do this. But if I ever got more money or more time or more whatever, then I would make changes." And that's usually not true. Verse 3, "A man may father 100 children and live many years, no matter how long he lives. If he is not satisfied by good things and does not even have a proper burial, I say that stillborn child is better off than he." This is just, you look at this and you say, this is Solomon. He says, you know what? He may have 100 children. He might live a very long life. No matter how long he lives, if he is not satisfied by the things he does. And by the way, when we're talking about a proper burial, he's not talking about a hole in the ground. He's talking about the people that gather around. Anybody who might be mourning him, anybody who might be saying, "I'm going to go because this individual meant something in my life." He says, a stillborn child is better off than he is. Psalm 127, "Like arrows in the hand of a warrior are the sons born in one's youth. Happy is the man who has filled his quiver with them. Such men will never be put to shame when they speak with their enemies at the city gate." Now, this psalm says that, it's important that a guy have as many children as he can. And this gives him bragging rights at this city gate. And even when his enemy is talking with him, the enemy must respect him because he says, "Oh, you have so many sons. You are so important." Children, specifically sons, were better than riches in the Old Testament culture because the more sons you had, the more opportunity you had for them to take care of you in your old age. And so this was all about bragging rights, the number of sons, but also about knowing that the older you got, the chances are you would be taken care of. Remember, not only was the incidence of stillbirth and miscarriages and early child death very, very common in those days, but because people went to war and people had farming accidents, you needed a dozen children to make sure that some of them would still be alive when you were old. And yet Solomon says, if a man doesn't like his life, it would have been better if he was stillborn. It sounds extreme, but it's not really. Bruce Springsteen is making it a point to soak in every moment by his wife, Patty's life. You get up around our age, and those are the things you're thinking about. Springsteen, age 75, said, Patty and I have had to deal with her illness. She has a rare blood cancer. It is a part of your life now. Questions are mortality, and it just becomes a part of your life. Now, it's interesting because if you have followed John Bon Jovi, he is a very, very different person than he was 40 years ago. He works with Habitat for Humanity. He has a soup kitchen. He often is in the back washing dishes. He's not a perfect person by any means, but he's a very different person than he was 30 years ago, 40 years ago. Bruce Springsteen, like I said, all of a sudden, because, Patty is diagnosed. By the way, they really haven't talked about it until recently. And all of a sudden he says, it has changed the way we view things. Now, he's age 75, still got probably a few years left. And he says, but now I have to see things differently. So how much is your life worth? And how, by the way, do you measure your life? Is it just the length of years? In other words, I want to live to be 105, even if the last 20 years I'm racked with pain and illness. Or is it about your money? As long as I got $1 million in the bank, I'm good. Or is it your children? How many children do I have? Well, I have X number of children. Or is it the awards on your wall? Well, everybody has to look at the awards and they have to be proud of me. See, we got to ask, how do we measure our life? Because what Solomon is saying is, if this guy is born and never gets around to figuring out what his life is and why it's important, then it was probably better that he was never born in the first place. Verse 4, for he comes in futility and he goes in darkness, and his name is shrouded in darkness. But Solomon is saying, if this person comes in and his life is only about just the manini stuff, the little stuff, then he's going to be forgotten as the moment that he dies. St. Paul said, therefore, to have legal disputes against one another is already a moral failure for you. Why not rather put up with injustice? Why not rather be cheated? That's 1 Corinthians 6:7. Well, the reason I bring this up is because if our life is about everything going well and us never having problems and us living among roses and sweet-smelling things, we're missing it. And if our life, by the way, is about justice in the sense that we always get, and we're always right, and we always get the right thing, we're missing out. See, Paul actually says, why is it so important that you prove yourself right? Why is it so important that you always are given the gifts of things? He says, why not rather just accept sometimes being cheated if it allows you to sleep at night? Luke 15:21, the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Now, if you'll remember, this whole thing was about the son originally saying, Dad, give me my half of the inheritance. I'm going to go party. And he does. And then when he runs out of money, a good Jew is found slopping pigs. And of course, that right there that's as low as you can get. The son says, at least if I go home, I'm no longer worthy to be called a son, but at least if I go home, I can become a slave, a servant of my father. And he takes good care of them. And so he makes his way home, and the father comes running, which, by the way, this is why I always say it's the prodigal father, because prodigal just means, wild, with abandon. The father who should have simply stood there and waited for the sun to get all the way, instead grabs his robes and runs down the robes with tears in his eyes, embraces his son and demands that they put a ring on his finger and new robes and all this. But the son actually says, I don't deserve. In other words, I now know what life is all about. See, I thought I used to. And I thought it was all about money and power and fun. But I have now come to know life in a far more complete way. Verse 5, though a stillborn child does not see the sun and is not conscious, it has more rest than this person who exists but never gets life. Now, it's interesting because if we take this from a theological standpoint and a medical standpoint, Solomon is not saying the child has no life, but rather has rest. The word here, the Hebrew word is naketh, which doesn't mean dead. It means rest, descent, stillness, peace. Okay, there's like 15 different meanings. When you read deeper into it, he's saying that this stillborn child has this rest that eludes this other guy. Our church body believes in life at conception, but in truth, conception is just the moment people experience the reality that God already knew about. This is all about eternal foreknowledge. Remember, time doesn't exist except in our world. So everything has already happened and is happening. It just blows your mind. Like I said, C.S. Lewis, Mere Christianity, I think it's chapter 3. But here you are understanding that this life, Psalm 139, every day of your life was written in a book before one of them came to be. And some of them, they never have the life. And so he looks at it and he says, we were chose before the foundations of the earth. And so even the stillborn have hope. Now, verse 6, and if he lives 1,000 years twice, but does not experience happiness, do not both go to the same place. More theology and biology. They go to the same place. And because Solomon is talking in faith and under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, and this is why we went back and talked about Luther, who says Solomon is not trying to depress us. He's trying to say, stop worrying about the things that literally take our life from us, that literally rip our life from us. It leads us to see beyond death to what God has promised to all who believe. Because if they both just die, then meaningless is too soft a word for this life. If the baby dies and just ceases to exist, if this old person who we've been talking about simply ceases to exist, then meaningless is too soft a word for what we are doing. This is why we have to push ourselves into seeing what Solomon is trying to share with us. Verse 7, all man's labor is for his stomach, and yet the appetite is never satisfied. Just think about that for a second. You see, God comes and he says, I put you in the Garden of Eden. Everything there is yours except this one tree. I got to give you a choice, because if I didn't give you a choice, you'd just be a robot, and we don't want that. So I'm going to just put this one tree there. But you have everything you need. We still choose to go to the one tree. Why? Because we don't like it when we think that somebody is holding something back. We always assume the grass is greener, that there's more to, that if we had what they had, we would be happier. And then we get what they had and we're not happy. So then we look around and we go, what I really need is what they have. Then I'll be happy. Then, no, I need what they have and I'll be happy. And this is what Solomon is saying. He says, just so you know, he says, I've tried it all. I bought whatever I wanted. I've done whatever I wanted. And he says, these things have not brought me the happiness that I was looking for. I was a kid, and my dad was talking about Howard Hughes, and we were reading, because back then you could only read the encyclopedia if you wanted to know things. And he was telling me about the spruce goose, telling me about Howard Hughes's life, how he made his millions. Because my dad would study these things, and when we were sitting in a motel somewhere because we were working, and it was wintertime, and so the sun set at 5, so we've got all these hours, and he was telling me all about Howard Hughes. And he was telling me that, Howard Hughes was the first real person to make $1 billion. And when he died, he was worth about $3 billion. And yet he died alone, hiding himself, allowing his fingernails to grow, urinating in bottles in his hotel room. He had all the money in the world, all the possibilities in the world, and yet it literally just took his life from him. And I look at these people today, and it's interesting. He was only worth $3 billion. Now we have people worth $100 billion. I want you to think about that, what you would do with $100 billion. You couldn't even spend the interest on that every day. And I'll be honest, I really don't think most of these people are happy. Some might be, and I'm thankful for that. Warren Buffett lives in a very modest home, still drives his own car to and from work. I look at that and I go, there's a guy who just said, this is who I am. But it's interesting because we've talked about this before, the number of people that say I need to have the newest, fastest jet. I need a bigger home. Let's think about this for a second. I saw in the last few weeks, a number of famous people sold their when I say multi, we're talking 10, 15, 20, $30 million homes in the Los Angeles area. And I'm like, what does a $30 million home have for you? And by the way, if you have a theater and a swimming pool and a putt-putt golf course and all this stuff, you know what that means? Somebody has to take care of it, and it's not going to be you. And now you got to hire people, and you just think about this. But nevertheless, every time we think that, we just assume, if I can just step over this line, I will be happy. When I get over the line, it's like, oh, that wasn't enough. Now I got to get over that line. If we could recreate life as we know it and change the world so it would love one another and serve one another, what do you think it would look like? If we could literally pause the whole world, stop everything, re-educate everyone about the truth, what would the world look like? So C.S. Lewis, in a couple of his books, retells an old story which comes from a rabbi. And I love it because he wants to talk with us about what heaven is going to be like. Because most of us, by the way, when I was a kid, my Sunday school teacher said, imagine your favorite things, which at the time was pizza and pinball. And he says, that's what heaven's going to be like. So it's like, oh, so I'm going to spend eternity eating pizza and playing pinball. And it's only when you get a little while later and you start saying, how long can I eat pizza? How long can I play pinball? And we begin to see these things. But C.S. Lewis says we need to reimagine heaven in a different way. There's also people, by the way, who start to say, well, when you get to heaven, you got this mansion waiting for you. Well, that's actually an extreme translation of the word. Because, of course, if I have a mansion, I start to think people are going to serve me. So, since I'm so much better than you are, you're going to wind up mowing my lawn, cleaning my pool. And suddenly we're right back to earth where, all pigs are equal, but some are more equal than others. So C.S. Lewis says, let me tell you this rabbinical story. He says, everybody dies and goes to the same place. Remember, this is not theological, biblical. This is just a story. But he says, everybody dies, goes to the same place. We all wind up in this giant banquet room, and the tables are spread out, and it is the finest food and the best wine, everything that we could imagine. All of our favorites are on the table. Except the moment we died, God removed our elbows. So we only have sticks like this. And we have forks and knives and spoons. The problem is I pick up the fork and I can't feed myself. No matter how hard I try, because I don't have elbows, my arms will not allow me to feed myself. And the rabbinical story goes on that some people at the tables are crying and weeping and screaming it's not fair, and others are laughing and eating and enjoying life. And the difference between the two are those who are only self-centered, only thinking about themselves. They're sitting there with their fork and their spoon looking at the food, and they can't eat it because they can't use their arms. But those who have come to realize that there's something more, they're feeding the person across the table who's feeding them. And they're laughing and joking. And literally it's, you want some more soup? There you go. Hey, would you like some more of that Kahlua pig? There you go. And those people are laughing and enjoying and having a great time. When we had dinner with Dawit and his wife the other night, we sat in the restaurant for about an hour and 20 minutes. And then we went outside and sat for another 2.5 hours. Just talking, sharing stories of ministry and life. And during that time, by the way, before that, we had gone across the street and bought one of those really fancy cupcakes. And we were just sitting there, and it was just about enjoying the moment and about one another. And it was interesting because with all the noise and all the craziness that Ward Center has, it was nevertheless just this beautiful moment. And that's what C.S. Lewis is saying. He says, when you get to heaven, he says, what you're going to experience is going to be determined by how you see your life. If you are the only thing that matters, you're going to starve to death. And you will have hell, literally. But it will be of your own creation. But if you see one another and the chance to serve one another and love one another, because by the way, if you go back to the Garden of Eden, a lot of people assume that Adam and Eve were just sitting there. Uber Eats was delivering all their food. They had people to clean the garden, tend everything. No. Their job was to take care of creation. They had jobs. It's just that they enjoyed it. It wasn't until they fell that suddenly all this, instead of joy, became work. And C.S. Lewis says, when you get to heaven, the things you're going to want to do, the things you are going to be excited about doing, will bring you joy. Your deep gladness meets the need, and we take care of one another. And he says, this is what I want you to see. And this is what Solomon wants us to see. Verse 8, what advantage then does the wise man have over the fool? What advantage is there for the poor person who knows how to conduct himself before others? Does it really matter, by the way, how much money we have? How much our clothes cost? The age and the style of car we drive, the house we live in? Is it enough? Because if what we have, do we see it as a gift or do we see it as something we've earned? Because if it's something we earned and it's ours, it changes the way that we're going to live. If we see everything around us as a gift, and I've had people argue with me, God didn't give me that, I earned that. Great, then it's yours. But the problem with that mindset is, if it's yours, then suddenly, anytime somebody wants to borrow it, do something with it, or if they damage it or try to take it from you, you lose sleep and your heart is getting ripped out. And so when we look, North Carolina and Florida and all those places are recovering from the hurricanes, and I continue to follow the Cajun Navy and the others down there. They are doing their absolute best, and a bunch of the linemen are headed home because they got pretty much everybody back with power and light in the major cities, and the rest are working on the rural areas. But if all of a sudden, because yesterday, by the way, when Daniel and I were here, it started to rain, and then it rained more, and then it rained more, and the river back there got up within about 3 feet of coming over the banks. Now, about 15 years ago, 20 years ago, we had the Concordia Portland Choir, and we had the Orange County Lutheran High School Choir here, and it came within 6 inches of coming over the banks. I'm not worried about it. Because it can take this building, it cannot take you. And so as much as I love this old place, and as much time and effort and money we spend taking care of it, it's not the church, never will be. So if it gets destroyed, we just find another place to worship, or we recreate it. When the person who is poor or rich, and it doesn't matter, because remember, it's the mindset. When they understand their life is a gift from God used to take care of others, it changes everything. This is a valid question. There's no doubt that it is easier in some respects to live with money than to live without it. Remember all those late night commercials? If you want to simplify your life, buy this. And by the way, we'll send you 2. I don't know what I'm going to do with 2 of them, but we'll send you 2. All you got to do is pay shipping and handling on the second one, which wind up being almost as much as buying the second one. But that's only if this life is all there is. If this life is all we have, then we should get as many toys. We should gather as much junk as we should. My heart hurts every time I go past these homeless encampments where literally people have stacked up garbage. It is absolutely useless. And then the rains come like yesterday, and now it is wet, soggy, moldy, mildewed, useless. And they just keep adding more and more because their mental health actually has them believing that it's all about more. And he says, we need to look at this in a different way. We cannot be pie in the sky, next life, don't worry about this life people. Especially, by the way, and this is what the book of James says. See, it's really easy for me to say, this life is fine because I don't eat breakfast, but if I had eaten breakfast, because there was food in the fridge, most likely I will get lunch today. Anybody who shows up here this afternoon gets either brats or hot dogs, plus pretzels, big German pretzels. So we're not going to starve today. I've got a place to sleep. At least I did when I left this morning. And if not, I can sleep in my office. I've done that before. And you see, when we look at this, it's so easy for me to say, yeah, life's good. Then I talk to my friends in Africa. I talk to my friends in Indonesia, in China, who don't have a tenth of what I do. And so I have to be careful. We walk this very fine line. And so when Solomon says God has given everything that everybody needs, no, I'm not saying that God did give it all. The problem is I took more than my fair share. This is why Jesus says when you got 2 jackets, give one to somebody else. See, there's enough in this world for all of us, but we tend to stockpile stuff. Well, I think I need 5 jackets because I don't know, I don't know when I might need them all. So we have to be careful about that. We can't just tell people, you know what? I'm so sorry that you don't have food. I'm so sorry. This is what James says. I'm so sorry you don't have a place to live in. I'm so sorry you don't have food. I'm so sorry that you don't have a job. But don't worry. Jesus loves you and work because James says that doesn't work. We walk this very fine line. And as we walk it, what God is expecting is for us to allow his Spirit to work in and through us, to sanctify us, so that we begin to see ourselves in our life in a different way. Verse 9, better what the eyes see than wandering desire. This too is futile in a pursuit in the wind. It is better to enjoy the things that are in sight, right before your eyes, than to have a wandering desire. This is that whole thing, a bird in the hand is worth 2 in the bush. Your life, whatever it is God's gift to you. Now, there's a very good chance that you have mishandled, misappropriated, abused part of your life. Because that's just us. It's what we do and how we do it. But you still have your life. And by the way, God always says, even if you mangled this part, you can still take what you have and use it for the sake of the kingdom. That is always his promise. It does not require us to have these 5 things, otherwise we're worthless. Instead, God says, I know that you have what you need. He says you need to step back, be a little creative, find the heart that goes with it, and find where you can take all that you have and use it to make a difference. Now, next week when we pick this up, Solomon's going to take it to the next level, because where he wants to take us, by the way, is not into ourselves, but into God's hands. So go in peace, serve the Lord, and have a fantastic week. Happy Reformation and happy All Saints Week.